In the center of the kingdom, her life was declared forfeit. Accused of treason, abandoned by all, she had no one left to defend her. But one man, the most feared in the realm, saw not a traitor, but the truth in her eyes. As the court held its breath, waiting for the final order of execution, he stepped from the shadows, and with a single word that shook the throne itself, he silenced her accuser and claimed her as his own. The cold of the throne room seeped through the thin soles of Lyanna's shoes, a chill that had nothing to do with the stone and everything to do with the eyes fixed upon her. Hundreds of them, like chips of ice, all belonging to the lords and ladies of the court who had feasted at her father's table only months ago. Now, they watched her as a wolf pack watches a wounded deer, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel satisfaction. Her name, once spoken with respect, was now a poisoned whisper on their lips. Lord Valerius stood before the king's dais, his voice smooth as polished marble. He held up a stack of letters, tied with a silken ribbon. Even from across the hall, Lyanna could see the forgery, the clumsy imitation of her father's elegant script. Valerius was a handsome man, his dark hair gleaming in the torchlight, his words crafted to sound like regret, but his eyes held a triumphant fire that was meant only for her. "It is with the heaviest of hearts, Your Majesty, that I present this evidence," Valerius said, his voice echoing in the dreadful silence. "Proof of treason conspired by your late advisor and his daughter Lyanna, a plot to ally with our enemies in the East to sell this very kingdom for their own gain." A collective gasp rippled through the court, a practiced sound of feigned shock. They were actors in a play Valerius had written, and she was the sacrifice in the final act. Lyanna's hands were bound before her, the rough rope chafing her skin. She forced herself to stand straight, to lift her chin, though a tremor of terror ran through her. "It is a lie," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "My father was your most loyal servant. We would never betray the crown." Valerius gave a sad, pitying smile. "The girl's denial is expected. Desperate words from a desperate traitor." He turned back to the aging king, whose face was a mask of confusion and anger. "The evidence is absolute. The penalty for such a crime is clear." The whispers grew louder, hungry and insistent. "Death." The words slithered through the air. "Execute the traitor." Lyanna's gaze swept across the hostile faces, searching for a single flicker of doubt, a single soul who remembered the honorable man her father had been. She found nothing. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was how it ended. Stripped of her name, her home, her dignity, and now her life, all based on a lie spun by a man who smiled while he destroyed. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. In the deep shadows beside the throne, a figure stood unmoving. Lord Marshal Cassian. He was a man carved from granite and silence, the king's justice, a warrior who had not set foot in the frivolous world of the court for years. He was a relic from a harsher, more honorable time, his face set in a permanent scowl, his dark armor absorbing the light around him. His presence was so unusual that it went almost unnoticed by the courtiers, who were too busy enjoying the spectacle. Cassian's eyes were not on the king, nor on the smug face of Lord Valerius. They were fixed on Lyanna. He watched her stance, the defiant tilt of her head, the way her hands, though bound, were clenched into fists. He saw the terror she fought to conceal, but beneath it, he saw something else, something the others, in their lust for drama, had missed completely. He saw an innocence that was as fierce as it was fragile. He had seen countless men lie in his time, had heard every excuse and desperate plea. He knew the look of guilt. This was not it. The king, weary and easily led by the viper at his side, finally nodded. He looked at Lyanna with tired, convinced eyes. He had trusted her father, and this apparent betrayal cut him deeply, making him vulnerable to Valerius's poison. He lifted a hand, a gesture that would seal her fate. "For the crime of high treason," the king began, his voice thin but resolute. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with anticipation. This was the moment, the final word that would send her to the executioner's block. Lyanna closed her eyes, a fleeting image of her father's kind face flashing in the darkness. She had failed him. His legacy would die with her, buried under a mountain of lies. The king drew a breath to speak the final, irrevocable sentence. Just as the fatal word formed on the king's lips, a sound cut through the tense air. It was not loud, but it had the weight of iron. "Stop!" the voice came from the shadows. Lord Marshal Cassian took a single step forward into the light, and it was as if the sun had been eclipsed. The entire court, which had been buzzing with anticipation, fell into a shocked, deathly silence. Even the king froze, his hand still raised, his mouth agape. No one interrupted the king. No one ever dared. Lord Valerius was the first to recover, his handsome face twisting into a mask of fury. "Lord Marshal," he spat, his voice tight with rage, "this is a matter of state treason. It does not concern you." Cassian's gaze, cold as a winter sea, moved from Lyanna to Valerius. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Anything that threatens the integrity of this kingdom concerns me, Valerius, and I have found that lies are the most potent poison of all." He then turned his attention to the throne, giving the king a slight, correct bow that held no real deference. "Your Majesty, the evidence is thin. The girl's father served you loyally for 40 years. I will not see his legacy destroyed on the word of one ambitious man without a proper inquiry." Lyanna watched, breathless. The world had tilted on its axis. The man she had only ever heard of in fearful whispers, the reclusive warrior known as the King's Shadow, was now her sole defender. She could not comprehend it. Hope was a feeling so foreign she could barely recognize the flicker of it, warming her frozen heart. It felt dangerous, like a single candle in a hurricane. Have you ever felt that? A glimmer of light in your darkest hour, a hope so unexpected it feels more like a dream than reality. That is what Lyanna felt as she looked upon the grim, unyielding face of her savior. The king, flustered and unnerved by his marshal's intervention, lowered his hand. An inquiry. "Cassian, the letters." "Letters can be forged," Cassian stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took another step, now. Standing directly between Lyanna and the rest of the court, a silent, unbreachable wall of black steel and hardened will. "She is a child, not an assassin. She will be remanded to my custody until I am satisfied the truth has been found." It was not a request. It was a command, cloaked in the language of loyalty. Cassian's authority over the kingdom's security was absolute, a power granted to him by the king's father long ago, and one the current king was too weak to challenge. Valerius stepped forward, his hand drifting toward the hilt of his sword. "You have no right." Cassian's eyes narrowed, and a palpable menace filled the space around him. He did not even glance at Valerius's weapon. "I have every right," he said, his voice dropping to a low, perilous growl that was meant for Valerius alone. "And I advise you to remember your place." Valerius froze, his bravado evaporating under the marshal's lethal gaze. He had overplayed his hand. He had not accounted for Cassian. Without another word, Cassian turned his back on the court. He gave a sharp, subtle nod to the entrance of the throne room. Two of his personal guards, clad in the same stark black armor, emerged from the alcoves and moved silently to Lyanna's side. One of them produced a knife, and with a single swift motion cut the ropes binding her wrists. The freedom was so sudden it was dizzying. Lyanna stumbled slightly, rubbing her raw skin. Her eyes met Cassian's. He said nothing to her. His face was as hard and unreadable as before. He simply held her gaze for a moment before turning and striding toward the grand doors of the throne room, his heavy cloak sweeping behind him. His guards stepped back, creating a path for her. The choice was clear. She could stay here and face the wolves alone, or she could follow the dragon who had just rescued her from their jaws. Leaving the whispers, the hatred, and the stunned face of her accuser behind, Lyanna took a deep breath. She straightened her back and on her trembling legs, took the first step into an unknown future, following her silent protector out of the light of the court and into the shadows of his world. The journey from the royal palace was a silent one. Lord Marshal Cassian moved with a long, purposeful stride that forced Lyanna to hurry to keep pace. He led her not to the main gates, but through a series of stark stone corridors she had never seen before, a hidden path that bypassed the gossiping courtiers and resentful guards. They emerged into a small private courtyard where two horses stood waiting, their breath misting in the cool air. One was a massive black warhorse, the other a smaller, gentler mare. Cassian mounted his own horse in one fluid motion. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, and simply gestured to the other animal. There were no words of comfort, no explanations. Lyanna, who had ridden since she was a child, gathered the worn fabric of her dress and pulled herself into the saddle. She was a guest, a prisoner, a ward. She did not know the right word for what she was, but she knew she had no choice but to follow. They rode out of the capital, leaving the stench of city life behind. The further they went, the more the gnawing fear in Lyanna's stomach began to subside, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. She watched the marshal's broad, armored back. He rode with a perfect stillness, a man completely at one with his powerful steed, his focus on the road ahead. He was a shield, separating her from the world that wanted her dead. After nearly an hour, his keep rose from the landscape. It was not a castle built for beauty or prestige. It was a fortress, a bastion of raw power, with high, dark walls and narrow windows like the eyes of a hawk. It was built into the side of a mountain, a sheer cliff face guarding its back. There were no colorful banners flying from its battlements, only the marshal's stark standard of a black wolf's head on a grey field, snapping in the wind. The place was grim, imposing, and utterly honest. There were no hidden gardens here, no secret rooms for plotting. Its strength was there for all to see. The great iron-banded gates opened for them without a sound, and they rode into a courtyard paved with heavy stones. The air was filled with the clean, sharp sounds of a training yard, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel, the gruff orders of a weapons master, the thud of arrows hitting targets. Men-at-arms, all clad in the same, practical dark armor as their lord, stopped their drills to watch them pass. Their faces were hard and disciplined, but their eyes held curiosity, not the malice Lyanna had grown accustomed to. Cassian dismounted and threw his reins to a young stable hand. He waited for Lyanna to slide down from her horse before turning to an older woman who had appeared at the main door of the keep. She was as severe and unadorned as the fortress itself, her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face a web of wrinkles. "Ilara," Cassian said, his voice a low rumble, "see that she has a room and food." The woman, Ilara, merely nodded. Her gaze flickered over Lyanna, taking in her fine but disheveled court dress and the raw marks on her wrists. There was no pity in her eyes, but no cruelty either. It was a simple, practical assessment. "This way," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. Lyanna followed her into the keep. The inside was as Spartan as the outside. The stone floors were bare but clean, the air smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the walls were hung with old maps and weapons, not tapestries. Ilara led her up a winding staircase to a simple wooden door. "This will be yours," she said, pushing it open. Lyanna had braced herself for a cell, but the room was not a prison. It contained a narrow bed with a thick fur blanket, a small table with a wash basin and a pitcher of water, and a single, unbarred window. She walked towards it, her breath catching in her throat. The window did not look back toward the capital. It faced west, offering a sweeping view of the wild, untamed mountains, their peaks scraping against the vast, open sky. For the first time in so long, she could see a horizon that was not blocked by walls and scheming whispers. Ilara left without another word, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was quiet, not the heavy, final thud of a lock. Lyanna was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence of the room wrapping around her like a cloak. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Ilara entered, placed a wooden tray on the table, and left just as silently. On the tray was a bowl of thick, hot stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a cup of clean water. Simple food. Honest food. Lyanna ate slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her body, chasing away the last of the throne room's chill. The sheer weight of her ordeal, of her fear and her grief, finally crashed down upon her. She lay back on the bed, too exhausted to even remove her shoes. She had been saved from the fire only to be delivered to a fortress of ice and stone. But as she drifted into the first deep, dreamless sleep she had known since her father's death, she did not yet understand that in the profound silence of this place, a different kind of warmth could be found, one more real and lasting than any she had ever known. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Lyanna rarely saw the Lord Marshal. He was a phantom within his own keep, a presence felt in the disciplined order of the guards and the profound silence that reigned within the stone walls. Yet his care was a constant, invisible hand. Every morning, a tray with bread, cheese, and milk would be waiting outside her door. Every evening, the pitcher in her room would be filled with fresh, cool water. No one spoke to her, but she was never forgotten. She was safe, she was fed, and she was left alone. This quiet solitude was a balm, but idleness was a poison. Lyanna needed a purpose, a way to repay the safety she had been granted. She began to explore the keep, her soft footsteps a stark contrast to the heavy tread of the armored guards. It was during this exploration that she found it, a heavy oak door, unlocked but unopened for what seemed like an eternity. Inside was a library, or what had once been a library. Books and scrolls lay in chaotic piles, covered in a thick shroud of dust. The air was stale with neglect. It was a room filled with knowledge and history, abandoned and left to decay. It felt like a mirror of the man who ruled this place, a heart full of forgotten stories, sealed away from the world. A sense of purpose, clear and bright, bloomed in Lyanna's chest. She started the next day. She found rags and buckets of water, and began the slow, methodical work of cleaning. She wiped down every shelf, dusted every leather-bound book, and carefully rolled ancient maps that had cracked with neglect. She worked from dawn until the light faded from her window, losing herself in the task. It was her first word in the silent conversation she was having with her protector. She was not just cleaning a room, she was tending to a wound, bringing order and care to a part of his world he had long since abandoned. Lord Marshal Cassian noticed. He would return from the training yards or the battlements and see the faint light of a lantern in the library window, a room that had been dark for a decade. One evening he stood in the shadows of the hallway watching her. She was absorbed in her work, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to decipher a faded script. The evening chill was settling into the stone, and she paused to rub her arms, shivering in the thin silk of her court dress. Cassian's jaw tightened and he turned away without a sound. Later that night, when Lyanna returned to her room, exhausted but content, she stopped dead in the doorway. Draped over the back of her simple wooden chair was a cloak. It was massive, made of heavy black wool and lined with the thick, soft fur of a shadow cat. It was unmistakably his. She tentatively reached out and touched it. The cloak was heavy, smelling faintly of cold night air, leather and steel. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the immense warmth and protective weight of it enveloped her completely. It was a shield, an embrace, an unspoken promise of safety. This single act of quiet care emboldened her. A few nights later, walking past the Marshal's study, she saw a sliver of light from under the door. She knew he was in there as he was every night, poring over reports and maps, the weight of the kingdom a burden he shouldered alone. Recalling a passage from one of the books she had restored, she went to the keep's kitchens. The cook, a gruff man who had never spoken to her, simply watched as she gathered herbs, chamomile and lavender, and brewed them in hot water. She carried the steaming ceramic mug back up the stairs. Her heart beat a little faster as she approached his study. She hesitated for only a moment before placing the cup gently on the floor outside his door. She did not knock. She simply left her offering and disappeared back down the silent hall. Inside, Cassian heard the soft rustle of footsteps and the clink of ceramic on stone. He waited a long moment before opening the door. He looked down at the steaming mug, the fragrant scent of the herbs rising to meet him. He then looked down the long, empty corridor where she had gone. He did not drink it right away. He simply knelt, his armored knees complaining softly, and picked it up, his large, calloused hands wrapping around the simple warmth of the cup. It was a gesture of care so simple, so direct. It pierced a part of his armor he thought was impenetrable. This quiet offering, this small act of warmth in his cold, orderly world, was a language he had long ago forced himself to forget. And for the first time in years, the warrior, who shielded an entire kingdom, felt himself shielded from the cold. He carried the mug into his study, the simple warmth a foreign object in a room dedicated to cold steel and colder strategy. He sat in his heavy wooden chair, the one that faced a wall of maps detailing every weakness and strength of the kingdom's borders. He drank the tea. It was not ale to dull the senses, nor water for mere survival. It was warmth, it was peace, and it reminded him of a time before the world had been stripped of all its color. The narrator's voice takes over, pulling the scene back through the mists of time. 10 years ago, Lord Marshal Cassian was not a man of silence. He was a commander whose voice had rallied broken men in the face of certain death, and by his side, fighting with a ferocity that matched his own, was a young, charming lord named Valerius. They were closer than brothers, their bond forged in the mud and blood of the Eastern War. Cassian trusted him with his life, and more importantly, with the lives of his men. It was during the siege of Blackwater Pass. The rain fell in relentless freezing sheets, turning the battlefield into a mire. Cassian's legion was tasked with taking the final ridge, a suicidal push that could break the enemy's back. Valerius and his men were to hold the left flank, protecting them from a devastating counter-assault. It was a simple plan, built on a foundation of absolute trust. But Valerius's heart was poisoned with a jealousy that had festered for years, a resentment of the honor and respect Cassian earned so effortlessly. He had been offered a deal by the enemy, gold and land in exchange for a single strategic retreat. As Cassian led the charge up the ridge, he heard the sounds of battle on his flank suddenly, inexplicably, die out. He turned and saw the banners of Valerius's legion withdrawing, melting back into the woods in a calm, orderly retreat. The enemy fell upon Cassian's exposed flank like a tidal wave. The slaughter was immediate and merciless. Men who had followed him for years, who had trusted him completely, were cut down before his eyes. Cassian fought like a demon, a whirlwind of grief and fury, but he was one man against 100. A poisoned arrow found his side, and a sword blow meant to kill him left a deep, searing scar across his face instead. He survived, but the man he had been did not. Back at court, Valerius had woven a masterful tale of overwhelming enemy forces and a tragic, unavoidable collapse. He shed tears for the fallen, even as he secretly collected his blood money. Cassian knew the truth, but he had no proof. It was his word against the charming, beloved Valerius. He saw then the true face of the world, a place where honor was a weakness to be exploited and loyalty was a currency to be spent. So he retreated into himself, into his work, building a fortress of silence around a wound that would not heal. The narrator's voice brings us back to the present. Now, sitting in his study with Lyanna's simple offering of tea, Cassian saw the same pattern, the same insidious poison. Valerius using lies as his weapon, trying to destroy another innocent soul for his own gain. But this time was different. This time, the intended victim was under his roof. Her quiet presence in his keep was an antidote he never knew he needed. She moved not with ambition or deceit, but with a simple, steady grace. In restoring his forgotten library, she was restoring a part of him. In offering him a moment of warmth, she was fighting back against the cold that had claimed him for a decade. She did not know the battle she was fighting for him, but she was winning. Protecting her was no longer a matter of abstract justice. It was a defense of the last pure, honorable thing he had encountered in a world of lies. Later that night, long after the keep had fallen silent, Cassian walked past the library. A single lantern still burned within. He stopped in the doorway, hidden by the shadows. Lyanna had fallen asleep at the large table, her head pillowed on an open book of ancient histories. His heavy, fur-lined cloak was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a dark cocoon protecting her from the cold stone. The moonlight streamed through the high, arched window, bathing her in a soft, ethereal glow. She looked peaceful, safe. A profound, aching protectiveness washed over him, fierce and absolute. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a silent guardian watching over the first flicker of light to enter his home in a decade. In the heart of his cold, unbreachable fortress, a fragile peace had taken root. But the shadows of the world are long and relentless, and a viper, once angered, does not forgive its wound. The fragile peace held for 3 more days. It was a time of quiet purpose for Lyanna. She had finished restoring the library to its former glory and had discovered a small, forgotten courtyard deep within the keep. It was overgrown with weeds, but beneath them she found the remnants of a garden, its stone borders still intact. She began to work the soil, her hands finding a simple joy in clearing away the thorns to make way for whatever life might still be coaxed from the earth. She and the Marshal continued their silent conversation. He would leave a pair of sturdy gardening gloves for her on the stone bench. She would leave a small bouquet of wildflowers she had found growing near the walls on the table in the main hall. There were no words, but there was an understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the small pockets of life they were nurturing in the heart of the stone fortress. This delicate truce with the world was shattered by the sharp, arrogant blast of a horn at the main gate. Lyanna was in the garden, her hands covered in dirt when the sound echoed off the stone walls. It was not the signal of a returning patrol. It was the sound of the royal court, a sound she had prayed she would never hear again. A cold dread washed over her, and she ran to a narrow window overlooking the main courtyard. Below she saw Lord Marshal Cassian emerge into the daylight, his face like a thundercloud. Waiting for him was Lord Valerius, astride a white horse, a picture of smug triumph. Behind him were not his own men, but a contingent of the royal guard, their polished armor and the king's own banner a clear statement of purpose. The sanctuary had been breached. "Cassian," Valerius called out, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "I have come on the king's business. He has grown tired of your games." He held up a scroll, the heavy red wax of the royal seal gleaming in the sun. "A decree. The girl, Lyanna, is to be returned to the capital immediately. New evidence has come to light. Her execution is scheduled for dawn." Cassian did not move. He stood like a monolith at the entrance to his keep, his hand resting calmly on the hilt of his greatsword. "There is no new evidence, Valerius. Only new lies." Valerius's smile tightened. "The king disagrees. His authority is absolute. You will hand her over." Watching from the window above, Lyanna felt the world crumble. The safety she had found, the quiet purpose, the first stirrings of a life she could call her own, it was all about to be torn away. This keep had become her only refuge. Have you ever found a place of true peace, a small sanctuary in a cruel world, only to hear the darkness you fled come knocking at your very door? What would you risk to protect it? For Lyanna, that sanctuary was now threatened, and the man who had built it was about to pay the price for saving her. "I will not," Cassian said, his voice low and flat, yet it carried across the courtyard with the finality of a death sentence. Valerius's facade of charm finally cracked, revealing the ugly ambition beneath. "Do you mean to defy a direct order from your king, Marshal? That is treason, a crime you seem so fond of investigating." He gestured to the royal guard. "I have been authorized to use any means necessary. Do not force my hand. Your loyalty is to the crown, not to some traitorous whelp." "My loyalty is to the soul of this kingdom," Cassian countered, his voice ringing with cold fury. "Something you know nothing about. You will not set foot inside this keep, and you will not have her." It was a declaration of war spoken in the quiet courtyard of his home. Valerius stared at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hatred. He had truly believed the Marshal would bow to the king's seal. He had underestimated the depths of the warrior's resolve. His patience finally gone, Valerius barked an order to the captain of the guard. "Take her. By force, if you must." The captain hesitated for a heartbeat, his gaze flickering nervously toward the fearsome, unmoving figure of the Lord Marshal. But the royal seal on the decree was undeniable. He gave the order. "Men, advance!" The metallic rasp of 24 swords being drawn from their sheaths filled the air. The royal guard moved forward, their shields raised. In perfect, silent unison, Cassian's own sentries stepped out from the gatehouse, their dark armor a stark contrast to the king's men. They formed a wall of black steel behind their lord, their own swords drawn and ready. The courtyard was frozen in a moment of terrible suspense, the two forces separated by a mere 30 feet of stone. Valerius watched with a look of savage glee, ready to see the proud Marshal humbled. Cassian stood at the head of his men, his face a mask of cold, deadly purpose, prepared to fight a battle at his own gates to protect the innocent girl watching in terror from the window above. The first guard took a step forward. Just as the royal guard's captain raised his sword to signal the charge, a clear voice rang out from the battlements above. "Wait!" Every head in the courtyard snapped upward. Lyanna stood at the top of the gatehouse wall, her figure silhouetted against the grey sky. She was no longer the terrified girl from the throne room. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a fire that rivaled the Lord Marshal's own. In her hands, She clutched not a weapon, but a heavy, leather-bound book. Valerius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have you come to surrender, girl? You will save us all a great deal of trouble." "I have come to see justice done," Lyanna called down, her voice steady and strong, carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "You claim I am a traitor, Lord Valerius, but the real traitor stands among us now, and I have the proof." A murmur of confusion went through the ranks of the royal guard. Cassian's gaze shot up to Lyanna, a flicker of surprise in his hardened eyes. Lyanna held up the book. "This was my father's private ledger. He was a meticulous man. He noted every transaction, every shipment, every movement of gold from the royal treasury. I found it among my things, and I have spent every waking hour in the Marshal's library, cross-referencing these entries with the military maps of the Eastern War." She paused, her eyes locking onto Valerius, whose face had begun to lose its smug confidence. "There are payments here," Lyanna continued, her voice ringing with conviction. "Large sums of gold, paid to phantom companies, all authorized by Lord Valerius. The dates of these payments correspond exactly to the days leading up to the massacre at Blackwater Pass. The locations correspond to border towns where Valerius secretly met with enemy agents. Cassian's blood ran cold. The proof he had lacked for 10 long years, the evidence that would have cleared his name and damned Valerius, was in the hands of the girl he had saved. It was the key to his oldest, deepest wound. "She's lying!" Valerius shrieked, his composure shattering. "It's a trick, a forgery." Lyanna's voice cut through his panic. "The final payment is noted here, on the day after the battle, described by my father as a debt of blood, paid in full. You didn't just betray your commander, Lord Valerius. You sold the lives of his men for gold." Silence. A thick, horrified silence fell over the courtyard. The men of the royal guard looked from the screaming, panicked lord to the calm, resolute woman on the wall, and then to the Lord Marshal, whose face had become a terrifying mask of cold, righteous fury. Cassian took a slow step forward, addressing the captain of the royal guard. "Captain, your oath is to the kingdom, not to the ambitions of a single man. You have heard the accusation. You see the proof in her hands. You see the guilt on his face. Now you will make a choice." The captain looked at Valerius, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a powerful courtier, but a desperate, sweating liar. He saw the truth. With a look of profound regret, he turned his back on Valerius and knelt before the Lord Marshal. "My apologies, Lord Marshal," the captain said, his voice heavy. "My men and I are at your command." Valerius, seeing his power evaporate, let out a desperate roar. He drew his own elegant sword and lunged, not at Cassian but at the captain who had defied him. But before his blade could find its mark, Cassian moved. He was a blur of black steel, his great sword intercepting the blow with a jarring clang that echoed through the keep. With a single powerful twist, he disarmed Valerius, sending his sword skittering across the stones. "It is over, Valerius," Cassian said, his voice a low growl. The royal guard, their loyalty now clear, surged forward and seized Valerius, pulling his arms roughly behind his back. The fight was over before it had begun. The man who had entered the keep as an instrument of the king's will was now a prisoner, his face a mask of pathetic, sputtering rage. "You will hang for this, Cassian," he screamed as they dragged him away. "Both of you." The courtyard slowly emptied as the guards secured their prisoner, leaving only Cassian's own sentries standing watch. The immediate danger had passed. Justice, after a decade of waiting, had finally been served. The noise and the threats faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the wind whistling over the battlements. Cassian stood alone in the center of the courtyard, the tension finally draining from his powerful frame. He slowly sheathed his greatsword, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. Then he looked up. Lyanna was still there, standing on the wall, her hand resting on the stone, the ledger held tightly against her chest. Their eyes met across the distance, silent acknowledgement passing between them. He had been her shield, but she, with her quiet strength and brilliant mind, had been his sword. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, they were no longer protector and ward. They were partners. He stood there for a long time, watching her as the wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. Then, with a slow, deliberate purpose, he began to walk toward the gatehouse stairs. Lyanna's heart, which had been hammering with fear and adrenaline, now beat with a different rhythm, a deep resonant hum of anticipation. She descended the stone steps, her hand gripping the cold railing, until she stood on the ground floor, waiting for him. They met in the center of the courtyard, the place where a battle had almost been fought for her life. The air was still and quiet now, the only sound the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the keep. They stood before each other, not speaking. There were no words for what had passed between them. Words were for the court, for lies and accusations and hollow decrees. What they had was built of something else entirely. The narrator describes their silent thoughts. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the fearsome Lord Marshal, past the black steel and the grim reputation. She saw the scars on his face, the deep lines of a grief he had carried alone for a decade. She saw the man who had been betrayed and who had chosen solitude over a world of deceit, and her heart ached with a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It was more than gratitude. It was a profound, soul-deep recognition. He looked at her, and he no longer saw a fragile girl he needed to shield. He saw the woman who had faced down her accusers with unwavering courage. He saw the mind that had untangled a decade-old knot of lies, the quiet strength that had brought light and order back into his desolate home. She had given him back a piece of his own honor, a piece he thought was lost forever in the mud of Blackwater Pass. The fierce protectiveness he felt had transformed into something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. It was devotion. He broke the stillness. He lifted his hand, the one that had wielded a great sword moments before, and with a tenderness that seemed impossible for such a man, he gently brushed the stray lock of hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers barely grazed her skin, but a jolt of warmth shot through her, chasing away the last of the chill. The gesture was simple, intimate, and it said everything. It said, in that moment, Lyanna did the bravest thing she had ever done. She reached out and took his hand. She did not flinch from the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles or the sheer restrained power in his grip. She simply placed her small hand in his, a silent vow that needed no translation. It was not the hand of a victim seeking protection. It was the hand of a partner, offered in trust, in loyalty, in love. It was the answer to the question his touch had asked. His hand stilled in hers, and he looked down at their joined hands, a warrior's and a scholar's, a shield and a key. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, as if unused to forming such words. "You were brave today," he said. Lyanna looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "You kept me safe," she replied softly. It was not a confession. It was a confirmation, a statement of a truth that now existed between them, as solid as the stone walls of the keep. He did not release her hand. Instead, he gently tugged, leading her away from the courtyard, the place of conflict and near bloodshed. He led her back into the keep, their footsteps echoing in tandem through the silent halls. He led her toward the one place that was truly theirs, the library. They stopped in the doorway. The room was bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and the wildflowers she had placed in a vase on the table. It was a haven of peace, a sanctuary they had built together out of silence and small kindnesses. The war was over. The ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. And in the quiet fortress that had once been a prison of solitude, two lonely souls stood on the precipice of a shared future, having finally, irrevocably, found their home in each other. 2 years passed. The seasons turned, washing the memories of fear and betrayal from the stones of the keep. The snows of 2 winters melted away, and with them the last of the chill that had clung to Lord Marshal Kazian's heart. The fortress, once a place of grim solitude, was now a home. The garden in the forgotten courtyard was the heart of this new life. Where there had once been only thorns and weeds, there were now vibrant bursts of color. Roses climbed the ancient stone walls, and beds of lavender and chamomile filled the air with a soft, calming scent. It was a place of impossible life, a testament to Lyanna's patient and loving hand. She sat on a simple stone bench, the afternoon sun warming her face. She was no longer the pale, haunted girl from the capital. Her cheeks had a healthy glow, and her eyes, once wide with fear, were now filled with a serene, confident light. Cassian sat beside her, his arm resting on the back of the bench behind her. He wore no armor, only a simple linen tunic. The fearsome Lord Marshal looked, in the gentle sunlight of the garden, like a man at peace. A short distance away, a small boy with dark, serious eyes like his father's and a quick, easy smile like his mother's chased a butterfly through the flowers. His delighted laughter, pure and untroubled, was the only music the garden needed. Cassian watched his son for a long moment before turning his gaze to his wife. He reached out and gently tucked a flower, a small blue forget-me-not, behind her ear. His touch was as familiar and comforting to her now as the warmth of the sun. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. Their fingers interlaced, a silent, effortless gesture of belonging. The world outside the keep's walls still had its intrigues and its shadows. Kings grew old, and ambitious men still plotted in the dark, but none of it could touch them here. The dark fortress had become their sanctuary, its high walls no longer serving to keep the world out, but to keep their peace safely within. They had faced the darkness and had won, not with swords alone, but with courage, wisdom, and the quiet, stubborn belief that even in the cruelest of worlds, kindness could still take root and grow. Is this not the greatest victory? Not the triumphant defeat of an enemy, but the quiet, sun-filled afternoon, earned by two lonely souls who refused to let the world break them. It is a reminder that the strongest fortresses are not built of stone and steel, but are forged in the silent, steady warmth of trust and cemented by a love that asks for nothing but to simply be. Cassian looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had brought light to his shadows and order to his chaos. He said her name, his voice a soft rumble, Liana. She tilted her head up to look at him, her smile as bright as the garden around them. "I know," she whispered, and in that shared look, everything was said. The child's laughter echoed once more as the butterfly fluttered just out of his reach. The Lord Marshal and his lady sat together in their flourishing garden, a quiet, unbreachable shield against the world, their peace at long last absolute and everlasting.